Okay, this lecture is on aluminum and its effect on brain health. The first image here is aluminum in aqueous solution. Aluminum is a trivalent cation, meaning that it has a triple three positive charge, and it is in solution here with water, and you can see that there's dipoles, meaning partial charges, whereby the negative charge of the oxygen can interact with the positive charge of the aluminum, and that'll keep it in solution. This is the only reactive form of aluminum. Okay, and that's really the only chemistry for this lecture. The rest is not going to be that much chemistry. It'll be easy to follow. Okay, this is just showing the location of aluminum in the periodic table. It's located right here next to silicon. That ends up being important. In nature, aluminum comes from the hills, the mountains, the Earth's crust, and it binds to silicon. It binds to silicon as a key point. That kind of keeps it away from biological life. There is no aluminum in biological life in the known universe. Okay, aluminum here, and this is from John McDougall, best nutrition doctor in the world. He has studied aluminum for over 30 years and its relationship to Alzheimer, and after seeing over 1,000 papers on the association of Alzheimer's with aluminum, his conclusion is that aluminum causes Alzheimer's disease, and the best way to avoid Alzheimer's is to avoid aluminum. Okay. The next quote here is from Christopher Exley. And by the way, Dr. McDougall wrote a nice letter on aluminum. Chris Exley is known as Mr. Aluminum, PhD biochemist, specializing in aluminum his whole career. He's got gray hair and he wears a gray sweatshirt. He looks like aluminum. This guy Exley. Okay, anyways, here's his quote. Biochemistry of the human body is a symphony, and the essential metals like magnesium are its conductors. Aluminum has no purpose in the human body. It is an imposter that replaces magnesium and creates a cacophony. And he too says that he is convinced aluminum is the cause of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, our bodies have no way, because it's not supposed to be in biological life, aluminum. It has no purpose in the human body. We don't really have a good way to defend against it. The only thing you can do with aluminum for the most part is avoid it. Aluminum, like I said, it's very abundant in the Earth's crust, and it all started when they started mining and digging into all these mountains, and they stirred up all this aluminum. It has a 3 positive charge, so it's a trivalent cation, meaning positively charged ion. We saw it complexing with the water. Okay, it can also interact with phosphates, and that becomes relevant, like for ATP, or carboxylic acids. That becomes relevant, like with citrate. In general, the brain cells, our neurons, hold our memories for our entire life. They don't really turn over so much like a lot of cells and other organs, so that they can, over that lifetime, accumulate aluminum, which is not good. Aluminum crosses blood-brain barrier. It crosses the blood-testicle barrier, the blood-ovary barrier, and so it'll accumulate in the brain, the testicles, and the ovaries. It also accumulates in bone. The best way to check it, if you need to measure it, would be to check a 24-hour urine collection. And by the way, this lecture is going to get really interesting. I got to do this warm-up stuff. Then we'll get to the good stuff pretty soon here. Some more thoughts from Dr. McDougall. Alzheimer's wasn't even described till 1901. It didn't become common till the 1940s. Populations with more aluminum in their drinking water, for example, have more Alzheimer's. It accumulates in brain microglia, but also in regular brain neurons. Aluminum is found in the Alzheimer's plaques called the beta amyloid plaques, also called the senile plaques, which are extracellular. That's useful to know, extracellular. Also in the intracellular neurofibrillary tangles, the hyperphosphorylated tau protein. Okay, so you find aluminum in both these locations in Alzheimer's brains, intracellular and extracellular. Okay. And let's see what else. Exley believes that aluminum in the senile plaques, extracellular, is promoting ferrous redox cycling. That means iron cycling back and forth between Fe2 plus Fe3 plus, and when oxygen is present, that generates reactive oxygen species and causes oxidative stress. So I'm giving you the fancy chemistry background for anybody who wants it, but the real meat of this talk is what's happening to our brain and what you can do to avoid it. And I just got to go through this warm-up stuff to get there. And because you're in the extracellular matrix with the senile plaques, the beta amyloid plaques, you don't have a lot of antioxidants outside the cell. So it can go relatively unchecked and do a lot of damage, for example, to the external leaflet of the plasma membrane of the neuron. Exley also noted that the patients with familial Alzheimer's disease who have an early age onset have very high Alzheimer's in their brains. This guy did testing of brains, autopsy testing for aluminum content. He also feels that aluminum is contributing to multiple sclerosis by binding to myelin, and he believes this leading to initiation of autoimmune antibodies. Just giving you his theory of the world's aluminum expert. And I can also tell you one thing, I listen to what everyone has to say. I kind of look at it as like the 6 blind men and the elephant. You want to see what everyone has to say from their point of view, but then you come up with the bird's eye view later. That, by the way, is a very good metaphor for thinking. You can look it up on the internet. 6 blind men and an elephant. How each one guy in the back thinks the tail is a rope, another guy thinks the ear is a rug, another one touches the leg, thinks it's a tree. But you have to have a bird's eye view to put it all together. So, because some of these opinions we're going to see, they're going to contradict each other in a big way coming up real soon. Okay, here's this guy, Dean Murphy. He's a dentist, and he's a pretty smart guy. And he says that aluminum forms complexes with F- that facilitate its traversal of the blood-brain barrier, and it gets into the brain. And once it gets into the brain, it interferes with phosphate reactions. And we just saw how aluminum's chemical structure is similar enough to phosphate that it can sort of interrupt reactions where phosphate is important for, phosphate transfer reactions. That's super important. That's ATP. From ATP to ADP. So that's a big deal. Okay. The next guy we're going to get an opinion from is Jack Delatorre. Jack Delatorre is the PhD who came up with the mouse equivalence, the vascular theory of Alzheimer's. By the way, I'm going to let you know something. I don't even like the word Alzheimer's. I think what you have is dementia. And all of a sudden, just from popular chatter, it became normal to call dementia Alzheimer's. They are not the same things. There are a lot of things that can cause dementia. Dementia is severely impaired cognitive function. And this idea of just calling it all Alzheimer's, I actually think, quite frankly, is stupid. And it makes it difficult to think about dementia. There are a lot of different causes of dementia, and you shouldn't be calling them Alzheimer's. And my own personal belief from looking at many thousands of brain is so-called Alzheimer's is a lot less common than people think. I think vascular dementia is far more common, but it's multifactorial. There's a lot of things that cause brain damage, and they all contribute. And the same one individual could have 10, 15 different things impairing their cognitive function, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so here's a quote from Jack Delatorre. So you got to remember, he's the promoter of the vascular theory of Alzheimer's. Okay, here's what he has to say from his book, Alzheimer's Turning Point. I got the page number on there if you want to look it up. While heavy exposure to aluminum, like other heavy metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, can cause memory loss, aluminum is not the cause of Alzheimer's because countries with low aluminum exposure have the same incidence of Alzheimer's disease as those with high aluminum exposure. There is no significant difference, in his opinion, in aluminum brain levels in Alzheimer's patients when you compare them to age-matched controls. He therefore believes it is unlikely that aluminum plays a pathogenic role in Alzheimer's. Okay, so I think that's actually a little bit funny that the guy who's trying to promote the vascular hypothesis says aluminum has nothing to do with Alzheimer's. Okay, and then the guy who studies aluminum for a career says it's the most important thing. So, and the truth is, I think it's somewhere, in between. I think it's a contributor to Alzheimer's, but I think the money is on vascular. It's just like lack of blood supply destroys pretty much everything in the human body. It destroys the spine, it destroys the heart, it destroys the feet, it destroys the eyes. I also think it's the money in damaging the brain, but it's more complex than the brain. The brain is sensitive and delicate, and a lot of things cause brain damage. So we're going to get to that in just a moment. Okay, high-fat diets are associated with increased Alzheimer's. The more coronary artery disease in that community, the more likely you're going to have Alzheimer's, okay? That sounds like vascular disease has something to do with it, and hypertension, okay? All right, now we're going to look at the opinion some more of Jack Delatorre as far as the beta amyloid hypothesis, because the so-called beta amyloid hypothesis, it has to do with the senile plaques, whereby this transmembrane protein, amyloid precursor protein, is cleaved, and if it's cleaved incorrectly, so to speak, it extracellular starts to accumulate, and then the accumulated proteins start to stack up upon each other. They, instead of being a beta helix where they're round, they become flattened into beta pleated sheet. Into alpha helix, instead of being an alpha helix where they're round, like round like that, they then become a beta pleated sheet and they stack up, okay? And by the way, I think the beta amyloid hypothesis is kind of ridiculous. I think it's totally overrated, but there is some value to it. Okay, but here's de la Torre, and he's basically saying, look, Alzheimer's largely starts out in the basal nucleus of minor, and you see lots of neurons dead and dying there, but we don't see much Alzheimer's senile plaques in that location early on in Alzheimer's. Therefore, that's not what's causing it. So I'm just letting you know, de la Torre's hot stuff in the dementia business, and he does not go for the beta amyloid hypothesis. He does not go for the aluminum hypothesis. Okay. We got to get through this theoretical stuff because it'll all tie everything together in just a little bit. All right, now we're going to hear Alberto Espe. He's a smart guy, especially a Parkinson's expert, but he knows a lot about dementia. Okay, and here's what he has to say. At autopsy, Parkinson patients that have more senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles had an older age of death. He says, how come the people with more of these senile plaques, neurofibrillary tangles were living longer? As in what he's saying is he thinks it's bogus, okay? That this, and that's the point too. These precipitated proteins of the senile plaques of beta amyloid extracellular, of the intracellular tau protein precipitates, hyperphosphorylated tau protein precipitates in Alzheimer's. And then Parkinson has its own set of precipitated proteins. Are these things really relevant to the disease, or are they just like a tombstone, okay? Something that happens afterward. Once a lot of, excitement gets going with a theory and somebody's making money off selling a drug for it, it's very hard to say anything from a different point of view. Okay, I think that's actually one of the things that helps me. I'm a radiologist. I really don't care what somebody prescribes for this disease. I'll never make 10 cents off it, but I want to understand it so I could avoid it. Okay? All right, so what else does Albert Espe have to say? This comes from his book, Brain Fables. It's a good little book, especially on Parkinson. Brain Fables. Let me show you de la Torre's book, Alzheimer's Turning Point. This is a masterpiece of a book. Actually wrote a book in here too. I don't got the cover off it, but here's his book on aluminum. That's good on aluminum. Okay, and what he then says is, many patients who are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, at autopsy, their brain meets criteria for Alzheimer's. Many patients diagnosed with Alzheimer's, at autopsy, their brain meets criteria for Parkinson's. And that's an important point. People tend to think, the autopsy pathologic diagnosis is pathognomonic, meaning that it's perfect, it's definitive, it's the gold standard. BS, okay? Pathologists quite often can't tell what really caused the patient to become demented or have their symptoms. So that's important to know, that the pathologist can't even tell, and that they can't even distinguish a normal patient from an Alzheimer patient quite often. That is important to know, okay? And I can tell you, as a brain doctor looking at tons of brain MRIs, I usually don't see anything. What I mean by that is I usually do not see a medial temporal lobe atrophy pattern characteristic of Alzheimer's. I almost never see that. Okay? I seldom see a stroke-related dementia. What I see every day, all day long, is a shrunken brain from atrophy. And the cause of atrophy is apoptosis, programmed cell death, and we can't see that on a brain MRI. That's by far the most common thing I see. Okay. What else does Alberto Espe have to say? He says, if senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles cause Alzheimer's disease, they should not be present in other diseases, but they are. And they shouldn't be present in healthy controls, but they are. So what Alberto Espe is basically saying is, these diseases are much less well understood than is widely proclaimed. Okay? Okay, the next quote now comes from Stephanie Seneff, and her book's around here somewhere. Yeah, another book. I always take the covers off, so you can't really get much out of it. But she wrote a pretty good book, mostly emphasizing on glyphosate. And she says that glyphosate, the herbicide in non-organic food, that's another reason why you eat organic, I recommend. She says it binds to aluminum, increasing its absorption through the gut barrier and facilitating it to traverse to cross the blood-brain barrier. So that's the point. It has a +3 charge on it when it's by itself. So when it binds to something else, that neutralizes the charge and facilitates it crossing a membrane barrier. She says it then is delivered to the brain, where the acidic environment of the brain prompts the glyphosate to release the aluminum. And the last place you want aluminum is in your brain. But like I said, it just tends to go there, including to the pineal gland. Okay. Now, we already talked about dementia and Alzheimer are not the same thing. And again, I think personally the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, it's like a wastebasket. Oh, demented old person must be Alzheimer's. No, not necessarily. All these old timers I see, almost every single, 95% of them about that I see, they either have both, 90% of them, Alzheimer's, diabetes and hypertension, or they've got at least one of them. And quite often it just hasn't been officially diagnosed yet, but they have both of them. So it's really diabetes and hypertension are by far the most common risk factors I see associated with all the demented brains I look at. Okay, and also a lot of times they're just called Alzheimer's, take a pill and go away and there's nothing you can do. But what I'm saying is once you understand the vascular hypothesis, there's a lot you could do to minimize, to try to slow the progression of it. Okay? All right, so here's my opinion on neurodegenerative disease after studying the brain for decades. That there's many things that are neurotoxic, including, we talk about all these heavy metals, things like aluminum, lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, other chemicals, F-, as well as excessive amounts of iron and copper. And it's this combination that damages the brain. I think it's sort of a three-part mechanism. Number one is you have a decreased blood supply to the brain, so decreased energy and glucose supply. Number two, you have something increasing the metabolic demand. So the metabolic demand is going up relative to supply. And number three, things that are intrinsically toxic to the brain so it can't do its job. All right, so number one, decreased blood flow to the brain. That's caused by high-fat diet, caused by excessive sodium. It's a vasoconstrictor. It clamps down the arteries so you don't get enough blood to the brain. A lack of plant foods. Plant foods got the stuff you want to open up your arteries. They got potassium, vasodilator. They got magnesium, vasodilator. They got the nitrate, precursors of nitric oxide, vasodilator. That's what you want. That's why Esselstyn says eat your greens, okay? You don't need to eat them all day long, but eat your greens. Eat some greens. I always have at least a salad at night. Okay. Additional things that are relevant is excessive psychological stress, lack of sleep, and caffeine are also going to make your blood more prone to clot. They're prothrombotic. Decreased oxygen delivery occurs due to sleep apnea. When somebody gets fat, they're prone to getting sleep apnea. Tobacco with the carbon monoxide in it, the smoke lowers oxygen delivery to the tissues. Some people taking these pain meds, these opioids. I've seen plenty of brain damage from that. They become hypoxic and they get a lesion in their brain, looks like carbon monoxide. The next thing is decreased glucose delivery. So decreased glucose delivery was these diabetics used to stick their finger, 2-3 times a day, and they don't even know what their sugar is at night. Now they got continuous glucose monitors stuck onto the patient, print out every 15 minutes. A lot of them are dropping their blood glucose levels at night, which means dropping the glucose supply to their brain cells, which means dropping the ability of that brain cell to make energy to rid itself of reactive oxygen species, predisposing those brain cells to die. Okay, diabetics are routinely cognitive impaired. The next thing is having insulin resistance all day long, and this is one of the great secrets. Sometimes Alzheimer's has been called type 3 diabetes, and I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to call it. You do have glucose transporters, glucose type 4 transporters in some of these important neurons in the brain. And what I think is happening, contributing to all this stuff, is that you're starving in the midst of plenty, meaning that if you've got insulin resistance, you can't get glucose into some of your brain cells that need it. They're not just glucose type 1 and type 3 transporters. Some of them are glucose type 4 transporters, and they're deprived of their needed glucose to run all their energy systems. Brain cells use tons of glucose. Look at a PET scan. The brain lights up with glucose uptake. And that's what I mean by starving in the midst of plenty. And these brain cells, they can't run that well on beta oxidation of fat. So what I'm saying is there's lots of fat in the blood, but it doesn't work for these brain cells. And now they're double screwed because the person is ramping up the metabolic demand by being stressed out, drinking caffeine, using nicotine, lack of sleep, MSG, monosodium glutamate, MFG, manufactured free glutamate, aspartame. Those are all excitatory amino acid neurotransmitters that ramp up the metabolic activity of the neurons. So metabolic activity is up, but blood flows down, bad situation. And on top of it, then you poison the metabolic system with all these toxic heavy metals, with aluminum, lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, excessive iron, excessive copper, F-, H&E. H&E is from the omega-6 oils, also some of these herbicides like glyphosate and some pesticides. So all these things are damaging either the mitochondrial function or they're damaging the chemical pathways that precede it, which means glycolysis and Krebs cycle. So you see how rough people are making life for their neuron, inhibiting all its biochemical energy-producing pathways, simultaneously dropping its blood supply, dropping its glucose supply, and then telling it, do more work. By the stress causes increased release of glutamate at the synapses, okay? So the poor neuron is screwed. And what does the neuron do? It says, I can't handle this anymore. goes into programmed cell death. All right. So you don't want to do this. And you can minimize all these things, almost all of these things. Okay, now we're going to talk about how to minimize some of those things. So, of course, the same old story, eat the perfect diet, low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet, 100% organic, 100% plant-based, whole foods. All right, but here's some aluminum sources in the environment. Deodorant. Forget about deodorant. We talked about this in other lectures, but it not only increases the risk of breast cancer, you say hi to somebody, hey, how you doing? You don't sniff their armpit, okay? So what a stupid thing to do to yourself. Put aluminum in your armpit every day and make yourself sick, okay? The worst is to spray it, because then you inhale it. It goes right through your olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, and goes right into your hippocampus, your memory center. Not good. Not smart. And don't be spraying stuff on your kids either. Like these spray-on sunscreens, they often have aluminum in them. Your kids potentially inhaling aluminum. Not good. The olfactory nerve of inhalation is the highway to the hippocampus, the memory center. Aluminum cookware, bad idea. Okay, and be careful about eating in some of these buffet places. You want to know they're using stainless steel and not aluminum for their cookware or for their trays, serving trays that are heated. Aluminum foil, don't put your food on aluminum foil. Like I told you, I went out to eat with my kids one time when we were on vacation, and I told them put my thing on that wax paper, and they accidentally put it on aluminum foil. I insisted on them redoing my sandwich. My kids were all embarrassed walking around and I said, that's part of being a successful person in this world, is you sort of respect yourself and you think with your own brain rather than always caving into, conformist, be a moron, peer pressure. Okay, aluminum anti-caking agents and salt, they're very cheap. Processed food's full of it. Processed food has tons of salt. Typical person eats like about 80% of their sodium from processed food. There's all these anti-caking agents in milk powders and sodiums. There's a lot of aluminum in a lot of baking powder. If you're going to use baking powder, make sure you get a type without aluminum in it. Pancake mixes will often have aluminum in it. Aluminum sulfate is used as a whitener in breads. It's used aluminum lake as food dyes in some candy, especially blue and purple candy. So be careful. You don't want that. Processed food almost always has far more aluminum than does unprocessed food. Cans. You don't want to eat anything out of a can. If I was starving, I would do it. But unless I was starving, I would never eat anything out of a can. Because aluminum gets into the food. And it'll say, oh, well, it's got a lining. Yeah, the lining is probably BPA or a BPA equivalent. And it gets gaps in it. And the aluminum ends up leaching into the food anyway. So cans are not good. And that includes soda pop. And, it's acidic, especially. It erodes the aluminum. But all these other things, iced tea, energy drinks, beer, canned foods, not a good idea. If you have to drink out of something, glass is better. It's inert. Cheese. A lot of cheese will have aluminum in there. It'll stiffen it, make it easier to cut. Frozen pizzas quite often have aluminum in it. Let's see. Some foods accumulate aluminum. Tea, coffee, and soy are examples given by Christopher Exley in his book on aluminum. And there are people like Dr. McDougall and others will tell you, oh, the aluminum in tea is not so bad because most of it's not absorbed. It has low bioavailability. Fine, but you know what? I don't need it. I think tea is totally overrated. It also accumulates F-. It's sort of like a snobbish thing, but I don't think it's really good for you. Okay, sunscreen, we talked about that. Cosmetics will often have aluminum in them. Hair dyes will often have a lot of aluminum in them. You can transdermally absorb aluminum, so you don't want that. Municipal water, they put aluminum into the water. I mean, how stupid is that? To clarify the water. So to purify the water, they poison the water, okay? That's stupid. And it makes the water look nice. That's why they do it. Oh, isn't it clear? Isn't that wonderful? No, it's aluminum in your water. That's bad. That's why you never want to drink tap water. Always, always have at least a carbon filter, and preferably have a whole house carbon filter, and then have a reverse osmosis in your kitchen, and try to live in a place where you can get well water, and check the well water first to make sure it's good, like there's no local fracking or any of that kind of stuff, or farmer runoff. Okay, infant formulas. Oh, this is a scary thing. Infant formulas, this is from Exley's book, they often will have F- in them. They're often made with soy. They often have aluminum in them. And they used to have MSG. I think they've taken out the MSG. But what I'm basically saying is, what a rough way talk about junk food for a kid. What a rough life. Kids do best with breast milk, okay? Hunter-gatherer societies, the mamas will breastfeed that kid for, 3-4 years, all right? And, a lot of modern women, they're lucky to get a couple months off from work. And so, in my opinion, they should get as much time off as they can to try to breastfeed that kid. Okay, cigarettes. We talked about the cigarettes having some, and vaping. It's sort of the heating element in the vapor thing that puts aluminum into the smoke. Street drugs often are high in aluminum. Some medications are high in aluminum. So make sure you check for that. Mining, smelting, of course, burning fossil fuels, residuals of jet fuels, all these things can contain aluminum. How to avoid, be a minimalist. Again, don't use chemicals you don't need, and avoid aluminum in particular. Okay, which means no deodorant, and avoid unnecessary cosmetics and anything you rub on yourself. There is transdermal absorption for it. Okay, what else is interesting here? Exley talks about silica. So silica is this element in nature, like from silicone, and it binds aluminum and it keeps it neutralized, and that's how it didn't get into all the biological life. It's thought to be bound to silicone in the mountains and neutralized. And then once it's gotten out of the mountains, it's danger, wreaking havoc on life. And it reminded me of the Lord of the Rings quote about we must destroy the ring, return it to the mountain, to Mount Doom on Mordor, throw it in the volcano and get rid of the damn stuff. So you're never going to get rid of aluminum, though. It's too financially profitable in society. But you can avoid it as much as possible. Okay, exercise. When you sweat, you actually excrete aluminum in your sweat, so it's a good idea to exercise a lot. I've seen some people make incredible health recoveries, and exercise was a big part of that. Ruth Heidrich, PhD, comes to mind. Janet Wakelin comes to mind. Anyways, those are people who recovered and survived metastatic breast cancer, okay? Who went vegan and who exercised like crazy, okay? Rather incredible stories, both of them. They both wrote books about their experience. Look at all the stuff on a sweaty t-shirt. When you sweat on a t-shirt, there's all this stuff there. So, anonymous quote here, make your pores 1,000 sewers. Exercise. Get out there, start running around and sweat out some of this stuff if you have to. There is a chelator that can be used for it, but you'd have to use that under, close medical supervision. Okay, here's just a couple references, some of the stuff about antiperspirants, human sweat, how you can get rid of some of it from your body, the problem in infant formulas with aluminum, and other articles and books about it. If you're interested, they're all there. So I hope that was helpful.